say frame 352. How many of you know what I'm talking about? You will. If I said Patterson Gimlin Film, how many of you know what I'm talking about? You're going to hear some really interesting things about that film here in a bit from our next speaker. It's something that I think has stood the test of time in many ways. There's been a lot of opposition against it, but it's something that we can use, I think, as a baseline to get an idea about something that occurred over half a century ago. And it's a way for us to analyze formative media. This was a film, it wasn't really video yet. And it gives us something to understand now with the accessibility of phones, technology everywhere at our disposal. This strange question of why don't we have anything really substantial when it comes to obtaining footage, obtaining or capturing so-called evidence of this elusive creature, or creatures, whatever we're dealing with. But this particular film has undergone a lot of scrutiny, a lot of enhancements, a lot of stabilization, thinking about what we can do to look into it to understand more about the figure, the subject in the film, Patty, as we like to call her. Her, by the way, that's an interesting idea. If you didn't know, it seems like we're dealing with a female subject. And this is a good opportunity for us to understand more because our next guest is a professor of anatomy and anthropology at the Idaho State University. He's appeared on a number of shows. How many of you guys got to hear him last night? Awesome. Are you going to be able to hear him again tonight? It's my honor to welcome and introduce Dr. Jeff Meldrum.
Hey, if we can go ahead and kill the lights, who's in charge of that? Make sure that...
I am.
Okay. Well, a warm welcome to those of you here for the first time today, and hopefully this will be interesting. I was surprised but pleased that this will be some new information for a lot of you. It also kind of hit a nerve when Daniel said over a half century ago. we're coming up on another anniversary here in just a few weeks, but the 50th anniversary of this film came and went with much less fanfare than I had kind of anticipated. I thought it would be, quite a big deal. The press would jump on the opportunity, whether to excoriate it or to laud its mystique and intrigue. But so I was all poised to respond to press requests, but I discovered I should have taken a much more proactive stance because it kind of came and went with really a whimper. But why are we interested? Well, before we go there, anyway, how did I become interested? It's when you talk to a lot of researchers of my generation, my age. It's amazing how many of them can trace the origins of their interest, their passion for this mystery, back to the initial airing of the Patterson Gimlin film or subsequent showings. But for me, I was a little fifth grader. That's me. Can you spell geek? But it's interesting. How many of you are familiar with Harry and the Hendersons, the movie? Okay, well look at this. Just to refresh your memory, one of the stars of that was little Ernie Henderson. When that show came out, my mom said, "Jeff, that's you." He's even got my cowlick. Well, I don't have a cowlick anymore. My hairline's receded too far. It's gone. But so fifth grade, I was at school, and the kids were all abuzz because there was this advertisement that appeared in the local paper. This was in Spokane, Washington, where we were living at the time. And they were talking about Bigfoot. Well, I'd never heard of Bigfoot. But I was already fascinated with great apes and cavemen and human evolution and dinosaurs and all this kind of stuff, all this intrigue. And so I was just mesmerized. Listen to this. when school was over, man, I ran home and I found the newspaper, and there was the advertisement. So I grabbed my dad as soon as he was home from work, and I said, we've got to go to this, you've got to take us to this. And so, as it turns out, one of the initial showings of the film was at the Spokane Coliseum. Now, I got onto the internet recently, and I found this archival image, and it's really, talk about nostalgic, because this would have been us sitting right up here on the third row. We got there early to make sure we got a good seat, and literally Roger Patterson in his cowboy suit with his hat came walking out onto the stage and was standing there right in the center of the center stage, just like that, right in front of us. And he introduced himself and his interest and what this was all about, and the documentary that he had produced in order to showcase this piece of footage. And then the curtains were drawn back, and boom, there it was, larger than life on the screen. Well, as we left the Coliseum, they provided sample newsletters to the Northwest Research Association, which was an organization that Roger had founded in order to generate a revenue stream to finance his search for the Sasquatch, the Bigfoot, full time. And so, of course, I had to become a member of the Northwest Research. I've only bumped into one or two other people who were similarly members, but membership is kind of interesting. Membership included the fee. I mean, obviously you could buy the book, his book, Abominable Snowman Legend Come to Life, which didn't actually feature the film. It was published several years before the film was captured. But membership also included an 11 by 14 black and white print from frame 352 that was mentioned, that famous iconic image with the full arm swing as she turns to look back at the cameraman. And also a 5 by 7 color print, as well as the opportunity to order casts. But these turned out to be very important. They were very early prints made from the original film, and so the clarity is just stunning. I mean, it's really remarkable to look at. And I mean, there have been times when people were arguing back and forth about whether, you know, there was another Sasquatch standing in the foliage over here, and you can see him in the shadows, and there's two brightly lit eyes, and you can see the outline. Well, I just went to my picture and scanned it, and the eyes were two leaves, and the outline was a twig on one of the trees, and just as clear as day, and put my image up beside what they were proffering, and you could see the remarkable degradation in the image through multiple copies and iterations of reproduction and so on. So I didn't, other than that introduction on the stage, never had the opportunity to meet Roger Patterson before he passed away. But I have subsequently had the opportunity to meet Bob Gimlin. Some of you may have met him in various conference settings or otherwise, and if you've had a chance to rub shoulders with him, you'll agree with me. I mean, you can't spend 5 minutes with the guy before coming to the conclusion that he's just as straight as an arrow as you can possibly ask for. He's just a gentleman's gentleman, he's a Boy Scout, he's you know, whatever else you want to accolades you want to heap upon him. And it's quite interesting to hear him tell his story, and both in a formal and an informal setting, and gain the insights that come with that. You know, the film has achieved a certain notoriety in part based on the perception that it is a very poor piece of film, that it's grainy and unfocused and blurry and indistinct and degraded and so forth. And you know, the licensed copy, the copy rather that the production company's licensed from Mrs. Patterson, and I don't know if this is still the case, I believe so, but it's a VHS copy. And it's old. If any of you still have VHS tapes, you know, we still fish them out of the box every once in a while because I don't want to pay the $3 to watch it on Netflix, so I stick my VHS copy in, you know. And then I realized, oh my gosh, it's like you can hardly see it anymore. But The production companies actually like that. The faded image, the scratches and specks, I mean, it gives it a real campy, mysterious feel, and it adds to the ambiance. But then it perpetuates this notion that it's blurry and indistinguishable. And there's even been cartoons written about this. So here's Bigfoot family at the portrait studio, and the photographer saying, I just don't get it. No matter how many photos I take, you come out blurry and indistinguishable. Okay? We kind of had fun with that last night, right, with the guy in the costume. Well, this doesn't do it justice, unfortunately. We're handicapped a little bit with our projection technology here. But this kind of a portrayal of the image just demonstrates how much information there is to be had. The image quality of the original and even the subsequent early generation copies is remarkable. It was shot with a fixed focal length lens, so that means, like the old point and shoot. Well, how many remember Kodak Instamatics? Okay, yeah, just point and shoot. So you didn't have to focus, you didn't have to turn a dial to focus, you just point and shoot. Anything from 2 feet to infinity was in focus. Well, that was the case with the lenses on this camera. So there's motion blur, where Roger was running across the creek, trying to get closer to the rapidly retreating subject. And then he ran into this sandbar. The creek had cut down about 3 feet into this large sandy deposit as a result of the seasonal floods that had scoured out that Bluff Creek Canyon and deposited a lot of sediment, washed out a lot of the alders that choked it normally, choked the drainage. He with one eye closed and the other peering through that little viewfinder, he ran right into the sandbar, and it brought him to his knees, which was good, because then he knelt there and with a much more steady hand panned across that iconic stretch where it looks back at him. All right. Now, I did it. There we go. Now there's the scan. There's a high-resolution scan of the 5x7 color print that I have still in my possession. And you can see there's just all kinds of anatomical detail. There are all kinds of features, some of which are still to this day are misinterpreted. I mean, I still have people say, well, how come there's a cutout? How come the eyes here, or there's kind of like a visor that's cut out of a mask? Well, that's not a cutout. The light is bouncing off of the hairless parts of the nose and the cheek right there. And just as when the palms of the hands or the feet are exposed in the direction of the camera, the image is slightly overexposed. And so where the light's bouncing off of those smooth surfaces, it's washed out a little bit, just as the sand on the sandbar, it looks kind of washed out. It looks almost white, when in reality, the sand on that sandbar, which I scooped with a little film canister, a sample when I was there, and it's a deep dark gray color, a very angular, eroded slate, which is one of the reasons that the footprint held up so well for so long. But there's all kinds of details. I mean, as we look at both from the face, from the top of the head through the face, all the way down to the feet, which can't be seen right here, but remarkable details. And we'll point out some of these, but like look here, you can see the tendons as they cross the knee. That's the tendon of the biceps femoris muscle. There's definition of the quads, the rectus femoris. I mean, as an anatomist, I'm looking here and they're just remarkable details to be observed. All right, but it always kind of niggled that in the back of my mind. Well, if there was this excellent print from frame 352, why would they just do one? There must be more. Well, in fact, there are, and they didn't get published widely, and the original prints sort of languished in a safe for a long time until they were kind of rediscovered and brought to light. But here are some examples. Now again, it's unfortunate. This is a very visual presentation. You're just not quite getting the full effect. But here you can see Here you can see, for example, there's the sole of the foot, and the definition is quite sufficient that you can identify, differentiate the individual toe pads. You can see the shadows between the toes, perhaps even some hair between. You can see those remarkably long and heavy arms and the curved fingers. You get a little sense of the light color of the palm, the edge of the palm at least there. But I mean, the other definition, you can see the shoulder blades move under the skin. You can see the outline of the trapezius. You can see the high attachment up on the back of the skull. Not as high as a gorilla, but remarkably intermediate between, say, a gorilla and a human. And so on and so on. Each of these reveals, now see, you can see how when the foot is perpendicular and really catching the light, it's overexposed to the point that the edges look kind of puffy, kind of fuzzy, because they're burned out. And that's taken by some as a negative. One of the critics, several have repeated the notion that the heel is jutting back beyond the heel of the man in the fursuit. It's just that the tendon is slack and the heel is more prominent, but this is exaggerated by the puffiness of the foot. You know, and building upon that, one of the pretenders that to be the man in the fursuit, Bob Hieronymus, said that the feet were like big puffy slippers like you get at Kmart, in his own words. You know, anything but. So, here's another one. Now you can really see, there you can see where the heel is exaggerated as well. But it's because the tension from the calf muscles is relaxed, and during the swing phase, the Sasquatch has a much longer heel segment, which I've discussed with some of you back at the table, in order to provide the sufficient leverage for this much increased body mass, you know. Like, as we said, she probably weighs in excess of 700 pounds. And when that tendon is slack, that extra elongated heel seems to protrude more. But as soon as tension is placed on the Achilles tendon again, the attachment is clearly at the very back, and the tendon produces a straight line from the heel to the calf musculature. There's a good view of the face. You can see how flat her face is, and we'll talk about that just briefly. Indication possibly of an ear, or at least irregularity in the lay of the hair due to an ear under there. But look at the slope of her forehead. You know, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of talk about sagittal crest, and sometimes that's a little misleading. She can have a non-existent forehead, in other words, with the frontals going straight back from the brow ridge towards a higher point posteriorly, without the presence of a sagittal crest. Even if there's a crest of bone, as you can observe on a skull, you wouldn't see that per se on the living specimen, because the reason for the crest of bone, that fin, is to provide attachment for the temporalis muscle, which fills the space, so the head would still look rounded, but just with this remarkably receding brow. There's just no development of the frontal lobes at the head of the brain there. Okay, I'm going to move through these a little quicker because I want to try to get through this. I'm going to have to curtail this presentation to stay under 60 minutes. We got a late start anyway, so... Anyway, they're stunning images. Now, why is this misconception perpetuated that is blurry and indistinguishable? It's because we start out with a 16 millimeter film frame that has a subject that's 1.8 millimeters tall, and we're blowing it up to the absolute extreme magnification to see the details there. Now, we have to think about film that consists of a layer of photosensitive emulsion, chemicals that react to light, namely silver halide crystals, on a plastic film platen, the base of the film. These are not pixels. Pixels are discrete packets of information, of digital data, which you can repeat with a great deal of accuracy and fidelity. But when you take the film, which it consists of all these grains. Now, you can kind of think them as analogous to pixels, but they're irregular pixels. They're not nice, evenly gridded, partitioned pieces of data on that silica. This is an actual microscopic image of the photographic crystals. And depending on the size of the crystal determines the sensitivity or speed of the film. See, these are terms now that are obsolete unless you're a purist and go back to regular photography, film photography instead of digital photography. But you have to understand it in order to appreciate what's going on. So when you make a copy of a film, the stock that you're copying to has a crystal pattern that's different from the original. And so your transfer always gets a little wonky, a little offset, and there are little artifacts that are replaced. And of course, if you then copy that copy, a second generation or a third generation, each copy introduces more distortion, artifact, and noise. You lose the clarity, you lose the definition, you lose the reliability of the information there. Okay? So one of the reasons to bring this up again is that I was just involved with a production which was highlighting some work I'm doing in collaboration with Bill Munns, who is the source to go to. I mean, he is the expert, bar none, on the aspects of the film involving costume, creature effects, and the actual cinematography, the history of cinematography, and the mechanics of the film and its editing and so forth, and copy. This is a new person on the scene. I met him several years ago up at the Olympic Project. He's a graduate student at the University of Washington. He's a computer scientist. He specializes in computer manipulation of video imagery. And so his name is Isaac Tian, and at Isaac's urging, we kind of dusted off some of the projects that Bill and I have collaborated on. And the go-to book for the film, if you're interested in the film, as a significant piece of evidence, and as Daniel very astutely put, the baseline that it provides for the appearance and behavior and nature of the Sasquatch. Bill's book, When Roger Met Patty, is the title, is a must-read. You really should read it. Bill, Isaac, and so Bill and I have collaborated on a number of additional papers which appear in the Relic Hominoid Inquiry. So it's a good source to find things. We've published some things about the integrity of the film itself. We've published on looking at the superficial landmarks, the skin and subcutaneous tissue, the features that are evident in the film, and making comparisons to modern humans and non-human great apes. But then, one of the other aspects of Bill's work is that he has very aggressively collected copies of the film, establishing a genealogy of their origin, their provenience, how many generations removed, etc., etc. But providing then a digital archive. We've taken the film images and scanned them, digitized them at the highest resolution that is available, essentially 4K resolution, and then created an archive. So if there's a question about a particular feature, for example, there was a big brouhaha years ago about a zipper toggle that was apparently observed by someone. Won't go into all the details of it, but there was no zipper toggle. And you could go to Bill's archive, and here were 8 to 10 or 12 images of that of a particular frame or series of frames where you supposedly could see this toggle, and you could quickly identify that this was an artifact of the copy, the interpretation, an erroneous interpretation of the copy that this individual researcher had access to, had attempted to enlarge. Anyway, to make a long story short, this archive is really, really useful. Well, Isaac saw an even more pertinent use, one that Bill had started to nibble around the edges, but Isaac introduced some software code that allowed him to create an algorithm that did it automatically at very rapid speed rather than manually overlaying. Oh, well, let me back up. So the three of us I think I started to mention, we got sidetracked. The three of us were recently interviewed for an upcoming episode of The Proof is Out There. They're doing a special edition. We were able to impress upon them the significance of the work we were doing to the point that instead of a 1/3 of an episode, a little sub-segment, they decided to devote an entire 1-hour special to the Patterson Gimlin film and our work with it. And so here we are. They flew us down to Los Angeles and created a really nice set with the three of us there consulting as various frames were put up on the screen that we could discuss and talk about and so on. So what Isaac has done is, with that algorithm, the computer program will automatically rotate, not only in the XY plane, but the XYZ plane, to line up the successive frames, or not the successive frames, to line up the repetitive frames in the archive for any particular frame in the film. And he's done this for that whole segment we introduced with that prime segment. I'm not sure how many individual frames are in that. There's something like 20 or 30. And this is just illustrating how the computer identifies recognizable, repeatable landmarks that allows it to do this. Well, and then in effect, what happens is, so here, assume you've got a subset. Here are 4 images depicting 4 individual frames in the archive. And here, the white lines indicate copy noise that's been introduced. And each one has a particular constellation of copy noise. In some cases, there's missing data, where it gets washed out, for example, in the copy. But then when you superimpose all of those, it nullifies the effects and focuses on the information that is held in common in all of the copies. So you end up with a merged image that is remarkably clear. And just to illustrate this, the network execs, given the controversial nature of this, they particularly wanted to have some outside review of the production as it was taking shape. And so they've got a few people sort of on retainer, some biologists and anthropologists. There was a biologist at one of the University of California campuses. He didn't tell me who it was, but the producer was impressed enough by his reaction that he gave me a call specifically to talk about this. But he said this guy's a bit of a curmudgeon. He's usually very skeptical of everything, and he certainly is not optimistic about the existence of Sasquatch. But when he watched the production, and especially when he saw the resulting merged sequence that Isaac had produced, he said his response was, "You're making it really hard for me to remain skeptical." He was most impressed by the I don't want to say enhanced, but by what we call the grain nullified rendition of the merged images. He just said it was stunning to see. He said he never had any idea that there was that kind of information contained in this notorious piece of film. So, and anyway, so we might back off and ask the question, what is the significance? Why are we interested after 50 plus years now? Why are we interested in the Patterson Gimlin film still? Well, because it is the most compelling by far. I mean, it really was a lottery ticket, a winning lottery ticket. Most encounters, virtually all encounters, all credible encounters are serendipitous. They happen by chance. People who go out on every weekend and claim to have activity, they're fooling themselves. They're probably not fooling many other people, but they're fooling themselves. It just doesn't happen. I mean, it just doesn't. I've never seen anyone able to demonstrate ongoing, repeated interaction. And I've looked into a lot of claims of habituation sites and so forth, and just unfortunately, to be very blunt, they never pan out. They under scrutiny, they fall apart. And Roger, in this case, I mean, people think, oh, they went down there and boom, they got the money shot. How is that? Well, they were down there for over 2.5 weeks. I mean, they were putting in hours and hours of riding and driving the roads at night after the logging trucks were gone, you know, and they were putting in the effort and the time in a place that had shortly prior had footprints reported. They were there in response to a long line of tracks that were documented, one of the most thoroughly examined and documented footprint finds in the history of Sasquatch research, in the Blue Creek Mountain Trackway that John Green and Renee DeHinden investigated. So Roger was lucky, but he was prepared. He had done his homework, he had done his research, he had a good camera, he had the best film stock that was available at that time. He had practiced even the maneuver of getting the camera out of the saddlebag in a hurry. You know, if you've ever, I remember one time driving down the highway with my brother, he was driving, I was in the passenger seat, had a SLR camera in my, on the bench seat of the pickup truck there between us. And here comes a big buck down the opposite side of the freeway, just about to jump the fence. And the thought occurred to me, I should try and get a picture of this, just to see if I can do it. And I tell you, by the time I grabbed my camera, pulled the lens cap on, flipped it on, had it up to my eye, and snapped a picture, I got a blurry shot of a white tail sticking up in the air as it jumped over the fence on the other side of the freeway. You know, and so, you know, he was ready. He had practiced. Like Shelley said, you got to practice these things before you actually are confronted with the real deal to make sure that you do it right. And he had practiced, and it paid off. It paid off in spades, obviously. And so everything since then, it's here, and everything else has been down here. What's that show with Tom Cruise and, you know, with me, here you are, with me, without me, with me, without me. Well, with Roger Patterson, you got it. All right. It attests to the physicality and the nature of a biological entity. I look at that thing walking across the screen, and I don't see something that stepped out of a portal. I see something that's elegantly adapted to the environment that we see it in, and that we see it in consistently over and over again. Something that leaves footprints in the ground, doesn't float across the landscape. It doesn't cloak. It doesn't disappear, you know, from the thin air. It provides a context from which to draw scientific inferences. I mean, there are all kinds of aspects of the anatomy and adaptation from which we can draw inferences about its biological, ecological adaptations, its paleontological, phylogenetic legacy. And this is the key I want to emphasize today. What we see there actually anticipates by decades what is now conventional wisdom in anthropology and biology, but was actually in many ways contradictory to the party line back in 1967. Things that anyone in their right mind, quote unquote, would not have incorporated into an attempted hoax to make it convincing. It just would have been a big red flag. And instead, we now discover that it was really prescient. It really foretold the future knowledge yet to be learned. So it's so important that we understand it in the context of the scientific conventional wisdom of the time, to understand why it was received the way it was received. Now, back in 1960s, in 1965, the Time Life Nature Library published this volume on early man. This was way before the internet, so if you wanted to know something about human evolution short of a college textbook, this was the go-to source. It really was. And it was graced by this impressive gatefold. See, I really was a geek. But this has become such an iconic image. It suggested this progression of an evolutionary array. Now, which is a little bit misleading, but at the time it reinforced one of the notions that was entrenched in anthropological thinking, and that was that the hominin niche, and I get ahead of myself here, let me get ahead to the next slide. And you've seen that image in all kinds of iterations. There are actually papers written about the impact of that image on the social impact and the memes that have resulted. I love this one. If you're a Monty Python fan, the Ministry of Unusual Gaits. Any student of locomotion has got to know about that. And here's Homer sapien. Here's a little nod to the paranormalists, so forth. I'm feeling this more and more each day when I spend too much time in front of the computer. Anyway. So the hominin niche was thought to be very exclusive, very distinctive. We talked last night, for those of you who were here, about the principle of competitive exclusion. The idea in ecology that a species' address has to be pretty unique to that species. Only one species can survive doing a particular thing. No two can be successful if they try to do the same thing. And so it was thought that bipedalism as an adaptation was rather unique. The increasingly large brain and the advent of material culture made the hominin niche a very exclusive club, with only one member species at a time. So even though this is just an artifact of trying to portray a temporal progression through time, to the author's, in defense of the author, he shows up here the overlapping nature of many of these species. But this visual image is just too impactful, and it reinforced this notion, which became known as the single species hypothesis, which prevailed in the 60s, that there was only one species of bipedal hominin on the earth at a time. And to illustrate how this manifested itself in anthropology, here's a comment from Dr. Joseph Biegert, who in 1969, these dates are important to see the context, he was the director of the Institute for Anthropology at the University of Zurich, and a very influential anthropologist of the time. He wrote, in reaction to the Minnesota Iceman issue, he said, the thesis to which Neanderthals, one explanation, this might be a frozen relic Neanderthal. The thesis to which Neanderthal creatures might still be living among us is absolute nonsense. Whatever supposed proofs, where did it go? Whatever supposed proofs might be put forward. Today on Earth, there lives only one species of hominid, modern Homo sapiens. Now it's interesting, there was a solicited paper for the California Academy of Science publication on the state of the science of Sasquatch, which I wrote together with Richard Greenwell, and we submitted. I'm very pleased with it. We had some good reviewers go over it and so forth, and yet it got squashed by the Scientific Advisory Board to the Academy. And I pressed the editor as to the rationale, the justification for rejecting it after we put all that work into it. And he said, well, there was one particular person who really dug her heels in, and I said, well, what was her rationale? And he said, well, she said, quote, it can't exist, therefore it doesn't exist, and it doesn't matter what evidence they think they have. Echoing this sentiment, real scientific. And I said, well, you are the editor. You're the final arbiter, are you not? Well, yes, but I can't go against my scientific advisory board or I'll be out of a job. And so it was not published. And I've had that thrown in my face, that sentiment, repeatedly. Well, we know that that there was evidence, namely that there were footprints. Roger had evidence to corroborate what was experienced by way of the film record, and yet when he presented that evidence to the scientific community, see, this is what he encountered, figuratively speaking. This facade sort of represents the some knowledge, the context of anthropology at this time. We'll call it the scientific paradigm. And it was influenced largely by the single species hypothesis. So here he's got this little bubble here that's shaped like a puzzle piece. There is just simply no place for that to go. There's no accommodation. There's no place that we can insert that puzzle piece. Okay, and so that was the basis. Now, what do we mean by a paradigm? This is useful because look at the words that are used in these definitions. A set of concepts and practices that define a scientific discipline at any particular period of time. Shared preconceptions made prior to and conditioning the collection of evidence. This doesn't sound like how science is supposed to work, does it? These preconceptions embody hidden assumptions. It's amazing, Daniel did a little interview with me in between presentations, and the notion came up that, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. This happens more frequently than I care to admit. Clovis, that was it. He used as an example the resistance to any acknowledgement of evidence suggesting that humans had been, Homo sapiens had been on this continent prior to the Clovis period, about 12,000 years ago. And for years and years and years, that paradigm was unassailable, no matter what evidence anyone brought forward, until eventually it crumbled. And there was irrefutable evidence of the presence of Paleo-Americans here on the continent prior to 12,000 years ago. But prior to that, anyway, we don't have time for me to wax too philosophical. But at the time, the paradigm, the understanding of what it meant to be a grade 8 versus what it meant to be an early hominin was rather different than what it is today. The chasm, the gulf dividing these two lineages was seen to be quite extreme. The ideas of such a creature as this just didn't align with either one. But now the situation is very, very different. Okay? So let's look at some of these ways in which the Patterson Gimlin film anticipated current anthropological understanding. We're going to only be able to focus probably on one, and I'm going to hop, skip, and jump through the others in order to squeeze this into the time here I've got remaining. But let's start with the first one. It's the best anyway. Dr. John Napier was one of the scientists on the committee that viewed the Patterson Gimlin film at the Smithsonian in its first showing to scientists here in the United States. They showed it to Canadian scientists up at the University of British Columbia first, and they ho-hummed and hedged and were unwilling to make any commitments. But then they showed it and got no better reaction from the scientists in the United States. In fact, they made some really inane statements that are indefensible, were even indefensible at the time, but even now in hindsight, in 2020 hindsight, they're even more ridiculous. But one of the most open-minded, one of the most sympathetic viewers was John Napier. So intrigued, in fact, that he went on after viewing the film and began to investigate the question further, and actually wrote this very important and influential, at the time, book on Bigfoot and the Yeti. Well, in that book, he came to the conclusion that the Patterson Gimlin film was almost certainly a hoax. But he was big enough to admit he really couldn't put his finger on the damning features, except that when he looked at it, he said that the upper half of the body bears some resemblance to an ape, but the lower half is typically human. It is almost impossible to conceive that such structural hybrids could exist in nature. One half of the animal must be artificial. Well, if one half's artificial, it means that it's a hoax. So, In other words, this was the red flag. You know, he just couldn't imagine anything like that. Well, again, his book came out in, notice the date, it's important. His book came out in 1973, so about 5 years after the Patterson Gimlin film. Well, a few years later, there were some important discoveries in anthropology. Namely, well, first of all, you're familiar with The Princess Bride, you know, and Vincini over here was constantly saying, "Inconceivable!" And Montoya finally said, "You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means." He's using it too much. Well, remember the discovery of Lucy? Those of you interested following anthropological discoveries? Lucy was an Australopithecus afarensis, one of the earliest representatives of bipedal hominins that we knew of at that time. And for the first time, we had good associated crania and postcranial skeletal remains, which included pelvis, the hip bones, and the knees and ankles that showed clearly that this creature had lower limbs that were remarkably human-like. And how was she described in the popular press? Well, isn't this interesting? From the waist up, she essentially looks like a chimpanzee. But from the waist down, she looks like a little human. Isn't it curious how evolution has proceeded with these unexpected combinations of traits, these inconceivable hybrids? What if Napier had waited 2 or 3 years, or not waited, but had written his book 2 or 3 years later, after these discoveries had hit the press and were being discussed? Maybe his conclusion about the Patterson Gimlin, that was the linchpin for him, right? And now the rug's pulled completely out from underneath that argument. You know, would he have changed his position? I don't know if he ever really did. It was too early for me to have had any correspondence with him, and he didn't write much subsequently. He had retired and went. Did not continue on or live on much longer. I'm looking for the button. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to close there. Now, we do know that this idea of bipedalism being an exclusive quality of the hominin niche is not so exclusive anymore. And there are lots of examples of convergent evolution of bipedalism. A recent one that was announced not very long ago was Danuvius. And based on the skeletal remains, it was a arboreal species that climbed in trees, but yet it had a pelvis and limb proportions that suggest that it spent a lot of time standing upright, climbing upright, hanging from its arms, or reaching over its head. Okay, so it's interesting. If I were to write a book about human evolution, and I wanted to illustrate it with a picture of a robust Australopithecine, one of these early hominins that had extremely robust facial features. We'll talk about that in just a minute. I could use this as a picture to illustrate that. I mean, ignoring the fact that she's potentially nearly 7 feet tall and 700 pounds. This creature was only 5.5 feet tall. I should say only, was 5.5 feet tall by comparison. But yet, you know, the resemblance is inescapable. The lack of accoutrements, the lack of clothing, of tools, other than, you know, hefting, opportunely available rocks, tossing them. Sound familiar? Behaviors that we know and dear. So there was a definite paradigm shift. Now notice this, a fundamental change in the basic assumptions and methodologies of a scientific discipline, or to see the same information in an entirely different way. This is the thing, you know, even today, people, the skeptics, will sometimes quote the utterances of these experts from the Smithsonian Committee, things like, oh, well, look, she has hair all over her breasts. Everyone knows that primates don't have hair on their breasts. This from an anthropology expert in primate skin. I mean, what planet do you live on? If for example, ladies, if you were to step out of a shower on a cold day, do you ever have cold days here in Texas? But if you ever experience goosebumps, goose flesh, what causes goose flesh? Exactly, the muscle called the erector pili muscle attached to the base of the hair follicle. So even if there's no obvious hair, if you have a goosebump, there's a little remnant of a hair follicle there. And I, beg to suggest that most female humans have hair on their breast. It's not something that's inconceivable. Another one of them said, look, she has breasts, but she walks like a man. Well, what causes a human female to walk like a human female? The wide pelvis to accommodate an enlarged birth canal, moving the hip joints farther apart so that with each step there's a greater tendency for list in the pelvis as the center of mass is displaced further from the supporting hip. Well, this creature, as you could see, had a small head, had a gorilla-sized head as far as the cranial capacity. And so would she have an enlarged pelvis, a pelvic outlet? No. Would she have a greater disproportionate distance between her hips? No. So would she walk like a human female? No. See? But those kind of statements were they're embarrassing to the discipline, to me as an anatomist and anthropologist, that these people, and that they get repeated. Even now, it's just all the more. I would add to that also when we view information through the lens of additional information, it can certainly clarify. So now, here we had in 1960, see this single species hypothesis, and if we had this unknown relic hominoid off here, it's in limbo, it's over here in the ether, there's no context for it. This is what Roger Patterson encountered when Ivan Sanderson wrote his encyclopedic book, Abominable Snowman, Legend Come to Life. The subtitle was Subhuman Species on 5 Continents. Well, that was published in 1961, right as the single species hypothesis was coming into focus. And so again, he found himself facing that same facade that Roger Patterson did. There was just no accommodation. No one took his book seriously. It couldn't be taken seriously because such things couldn't exist according to this paradigm. Now we see human evolution like this. So suddenly there is a context. See, if we go to, well, here's just this was in 07, and already this is obsolete. I updated it once, but I would have to add 2 or 3 more species over here to add to this figure. This was acknowledged by the anthropological community, well, by the scientific community broadly in 2012, New Scientist, which is the British version of, say, Discover magazine here in the States, published a feature article with the theme, Human Evolution, the 10 Biggest Questions. And look here at number 9, are other hominins alive today? Well, I saw that, I was stunned. I was contacted, I became aware of it when the editor, or one of the associate editors writing for that question, contacted me and interviewed me. The write-up was terrible, unfortunately. He clearly was still struggling under the old paradigm. but nevertheless, it gave a springboard to discuss this topic and the fact that it was even brought up and entertained. So here I am now, in the present years, 50 plus years later, and I would replace the single species hypothesis now with the notion of a persistent multi-species hypothesis. And so we could say a shifting paradigm, and now see, you can't see it, but you can barely see it, because right here's a gap. The colors aren't coming through very well, so there should be some blue there. So there's a void, you can see the edge of the void, that will accommodate the Patterson Gimlin film. There is no reason, there's no justification. There are reasons, obviously, personal, ideological reasons, but there is no justification for anyone to say they can't exist, therefore they don't. It's not impossible at all. There's no reason they couldn't exist. The question is, what's the probability? How good is the evidence that suggests that something does in fact exist? Well, you've got to evaluate the evidence. You have to at least give the evidence a chance, right? Well, now there's no rationale to do that. All right, so I'm not going to be able to go through these other points, but my point is simply this, and I'll wrap up. This is just one of a whole string of ways in which the film has anticipated by decades what has now come to light. We saw this hybrid notion, the retention of midfoot flexibility with a non-divergent hallux. You know, when I proposed this mid-tarsal break, there were those who criticized it, anthropologists, a couple of my colleagues on camera criticized it, saying, well, you wouldn't get a non-divergent toe with a flexible instep because the only reason for aligning the toe with the other is to incorporate it into a longitudinal arch. Well, that's looking at it backwards. The only reason to have a divergent toe is why? To grab onto things, to climb in trees. If you're not climbing in trees, you don't need a divergent toe. In fact, you're likely to stub it or get in the way. And so it makes more sense when a chimpanzee is developing in utero, it has a foot that looks more like ours than a chimpanzee. That divergent toe develops later in the process. It's a more recent innovation in the chimpanzee. Okay, deep jaws with a flat face. Well, it was thought that the face got flatter and flatter in humans as the jaws got smaller and smaller and smaller. But the other reason that their face gets flatter is to redirect the line of pull of the muscles to emphasize grinding function of the premolars and molars instead of big canines and incisors to process foods. Non-projecting canines in the absence of tools. For the longest time it was thought the only reason we lost our big fighting canines is because we could stab our competitors with a stone knife. We had stone tools, and so we didn't need that, and our jaws were getting smaller anyway. But now we understand that that's one of the reasons, reduced antagonistic interactions, but the other important reason is if you are evolving big, heavy jaws with very large teeth, it's also useful to be able to grind side to side. And if you have these projecting canines, interlocking canines, you can't do that. If you lose the canines, then you can grind side to side. Okay? Anyway, so the point being, we don't see on the film what one might envision for a giant hairy ape monster like King Kong. Instead, we actually see something that is very similar to the adaptations of a robust Australopithecine that has this remarkable derived chewing apparatus, but combined with a small brain, but upright posture, etc., that wasn't even known to science and understood by science, let alone published by science, for 10, 20, 30 years down the road from the making of this film. Okay, so I'm going to flash through just to tease you with these images, but I can't talk about them because I'm out of time. I'll stop and show maybe one or two here, one that I'm really impressed with. Oh, this one you got to see. You can't see. It's washed out. Well, you can almost see. Notice as that lead foot swings forward, can you see the toes? And right when they point up, look how long they are. They're remarkably long. And although when researchers would look at the bottom of the foot, the sole pad goes way up under the toes, so it looks like little kind of peas in a pod with short toes. But there's a little indication right there of a flexion crease. That flexion crease, that split ball, quote unquote, as it was sometimes called by those who did at least notice it, but didn't understand what it meant. Just like on the palm of your hand, you have a transverse crease that corresponds to the knuckles. Your palm webs your fingers a little bit past the knuckles. So when the knuckles bend, there has to be a crease to accommodate that flexion. Well, so look, based on those features, okay, based on those features, then that puts that as the length of the toes. Well, doesn't that look just exactly like what you see right there? Boom. It matches perfectly. All right. Okay. And in fact, you had that flexion crease. Go back and look at your birth certificate if you have an inked footprint. We're all born with that flexion crease in the exact same spot. It's just that when our foot continues to develop and differentiate, and the ball fills in, that crease becomes very inconspicuous, if present at all. Some people it is. I have one boy who has hypermobile flat feet, gets around just fine. He's a very ardent soccer player. It resulted in a stress fracture in one of his metatarsals, but he still has the crease across his foot, just like a Sasquatch brain. So I've got casts of his feet in my collection. All right. Well, here's one quick insight. I can't go past these without talking. This is the set of 10 casts that was made by Bob Titmus a week after the film was shot. You know, and I've drawn attention to that now, since I brought attention to it, the imprint that shows the pressure ridge that was largely the basis of my modeling of the foot with the mid-tarsal break. And the critics would say, okay, well, but if you're right, then why is there only one footprint that shows that? Well, you take the other 10 that Bob cast, turn them on their sides, and boom, boom, boom. There's the pressure ridge. In exactly the same spot, if you measure it from the toes back, the variation in length of these casts, this is all to scale, is in the amount of impress of the heel. You know, when you're really striding out, almost to the point of running, and you're forward on your feet. Of course, it's different with us with an arch, but you get the point. There's another example, different than the Titmus one, that does show. This is from the film. We searched and searched. M.K. Davis actually located this. I kept pestering. He kept showing me all these really bizarre features that were more imagination than reality. I said, look at the feet. Look at the feet. You know, find me some examples of midfoot flexibility. And he did. He found some great ones and searched until he found this is just as the creature was going up the sandbar that Roger ran into and left a footprint that shows that. Now look at this. This is Jerry Crew, and here's that famous footprint from 1958. And unfortunately, as you can see from the flash behind the shadow, the news photographer used a very strong flash, and that will flatten things out. You can't see contours very well. I had the opportunity to visit John Crew, one of Jerry's sons, who is now the current custodian of that footprint cast. He allowed me to take it out of the shadow box it was wired into and examine it, and look at this when you turn it on its side. Yep. There's the pressure ridge. So the big guy had a pressure ridge, had a midfoot flexibility, just like Patty, right down to the details. And then of course I went to China, and boom, I saw a pair of footprint casts which were indistinguishable from Patty's, except a little bit broader. But look at there's the pressure ridge in the same place, the same orientation. This was 1995. This guy couldn't speak English. He didn't have any clue about Sasquatch. I gave him a copy, a reprint of one of my papers that had this figure, these 3D scans of that Titmus cast. Oh man, he got excited. And he goes, oh, look, and he's thumping it with his index finger, and he's pulling on my jacket. And I said, yeah. Okay. He couldn't speak English. And they wouldn't let me see his cast until they had the cameras rolling so they could capture my reaction. And so when he opened up his little suitcase and he pulled the toweling out, boom, there it was. Now think about it, you know, asking for smoking guns, did it again. This was first cast in 1967. But no one had drawn attention to the real interpretation of this, or even to its, noticing it that much. There were very few pictures of this published, and those that were so, they were screened pictures, newsprint style pictures. They were so low resolution, you couldn't differentiate what was going on there. And so the first time I mentioned it in print was 1999. This was cast in 1995. This cast comes from the Blue Mountains outside of Walla Walla. Paul Freeman, there's the transverse pressure ridge, 1991. Where did these guys get the little black book with instructions on how to fake a footprint cast according to Dr. Meldrum's specifications? You know, it's just, as Renee DeHindem would say, it boggles the mind. Anyway, we don't have time to go into that. There's precedent in the fossil record, and I have driven that message home till people are finally taking notice of it. Okay, then you got to see this picture. Here's that Paranthropus, that deep-jawed, canine, short canine, massive tooth enlargement back here. Look at how it lines up with Patty. Now, whether these are closely related or linear in this being a Paranthropus extant or not can be debated. What can't be debated is that Patty exhibits the same morphology, the same adaptation of heavy chewing. We talked a little bit about this last night. So this was a figure actually from Bill Munns, who, unknown to me, had also included an image in one of his presentations drawing the same correlation between, this was actually one of his reconstructions of Paranthropus with a side view of Patty instead of that iconic 352. Okay, let's see. We did all that last night. There was one I just wanted to end on. In fact, I need to end right away, so I'm going to get to the very end. I got to show you this. So remember when early on when I said all the anatomical details you could see, and I said, look at the trapezius and how high up on the skull? Well, look at this. So, on a gorilla that has this projecting heavy face and a not quite so upright posture and a very small brain, so to balance all this weight out in front of the pivot point, which is the opening for the spine into the base of the cranium, the foramen magnum. The muscles are very large. This is the trapezius, but there are lots of deeper muscles too. But notice how the attachment's really high up on the head. In humans, this is a bit exaggerated, this drawing, but it was the best I could come up with when I was putting this together. We look like pencil necks. We have short small trapezius tucked under, and we can balance pretty well because the foramen magnum is essentially further forward because the face is smaller, doesn't jet out as far, and our brain has enlarged, and when it enlarges, it kind of enlarges in a C shape. It enlarges back in this direction. So it makes the occipital region stick out back here because the frontal area has filled in. So the muscles are tucked way down underneath. Well, look at the intermediacy of this. I mean, they couldn't have... How did they get it so right in 1967? Look at this now. See, there's how the attachment would be. This is on the reconstructed skeleton that we created based on Patty by using a scan of a Neanderthal skeleton, but replacing the skull with Paranthropus and increasing or altering the proportions from a Neanderthal to those observed on Patty. So you can see these massively broad shoulders, this cape-like trapezius. Look at it there. Look at the immensity of that back there. I mean, show me a costume in 1967 that looks like that. There's a few animatronic gorilla costumes out there that look kind of like that. All right, on and on and on and on. See, I could talk forever, right? So the point is that I want you to be impressed with the Patterson Gimlin film anticipated in multiple ways significant aspects of current anthropological understanding of hominids by decades. Now, give him the benefit of the doubt, and he got one thing right by sheer luck, by dumb luck, or he or someone else advising him would have been more likely. But to get 4, 5, 6 critical, significant adaptations correct, so that 20, 30, 40 years down the road, looking at the film with technologies that they couldn't have imagined being in existence, we discover the congruence to current anthropological thought. So, the end? Not yet. One more slide. So here's that book I was telling you about, When Roger Met Patty. If you don't want to fork out for the book, he has lots of materials online, although I strongly recommend you do. It's the Munns Report. If you Google the Munns Report, of course you can look at the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, just Google that, and there are lots of the papers that pertain directly to the Patterson Gimlin film. And then, of course, in my book, there's a chapter when Wrangler, how did I title it? The Wrangler Meets the Wild Woman, which is the Patterson Gimlin film from Bob Gimlin's point of view, his interviews emphasized and so forth, and then my interpretations of the film at that point. I mean, here's one more. Just real quick, Walter Grieve, the film was shown to a British biomechanist when René de Hinden took it on a European tour. And this biomechanist, an expert in human biomechanics, he looked at the film and he said, if the film, and there was controversy at that time, if the film was shot at 22 frames per second, which would have been the preferred speed for broadcast quality cinematography, 22 frames exposed in each second, film going through pretty rapidly, so there would be less motion blur. Then he said, based on his calculations, a human could replicate the stride and the period of the pendulum of the arms and so forth. But he said, if it was shot at a slower rate of film speed, like 16 to 18, he said a human couldn't do that. It was something non-human. Well, subsequently, through several independent lines of evidence, it's absolutely established that the film was shot at 16 frames per second. No doubt whatsoever. So I had the opportunity, one of Walter Grieve's students contacted me, he was over here in the States pursuing his education or teaching or something, I can't remember what it was, but he contacted me, and Walter was still alive and around, and quite of sound mind. I said, could I reach out to him? He said, oh yeah, he said, this is fascinating. So we reached out to him, and I sent him the excerpts from my book where I quoted his work and so forth, and showed him the arguments for it being shot at 16 frames per second. I said, so what's your reaction? And he thought for a minute, he said, I stand by my statement. Meaning that in his estimation then, it could not have been a man in a fursuit because of the film speed. So again, anticipating future, well in this case, unintentionally or unwittingly anticipating the techniques that would be available to establish the film speed, even though Roger stated that he had forgotten. He thought he'd set it at 22 frames per second, but when he took the film out and looked at the camera, it was on 16 frames. So there was controversy. Anyway, so thanks so much. There's so much to talk about this film, and that's the thing. Appreciate your attention.
If you liked this video, be sure to check out our other content and get connected on our page and social media sites. Every day, new discoveries are being made all across the world and beyond, so let's work together to find out what's next. And remember, we won't know if we don't go. I'll see you in the vortex.